The brass bands swelled as bunting cracked in the desert wind, and 100 voices rose on Redemption Ridge. The narrator watched Marshal Everett Kane lift his hat and smile like a sunrise carved from steel. Caleb Hart kept to the shade, jaw tight, coat dusted by the long road. Tommy Reed waved from the steps, cheeks bright with hope that felt fragile. Sheriff Victor Crow hovered near the dais, eyes weighing purses more than people. Lydia Vale leaned from the saloon balcony, voice soft as she sang a tune no one quite knew. Silas Boone stood by the chapel bell, palms folded, seeing more than smoke and confetti. A rifle barked from nowhere, and the music died mid-breath. Glass leapt from a storefront as the crowd broke like a herd. Caleb moved before thought and dragged a bleeding boy behind sandbags. Crow shouted orders that sounded like threats, and Kane drew steady as a saint. The town cheered the star, but the dust tasted of sulfur. Sirens were not part of this land, so fear spoke in hoofbeats and the thin cry of a mother. Caleb steadied the boy and tied a strip of shirt, while the narrator marked how quick hands can outpace doubt. Tommy slid to his knees, breath ragged, asking where the shot came from. Caleb said, "High steel, bell tower," and Tommy nodded like a student, hungry for marks. Crow floated near, praising Kane loud enough for the fearful to hear. Kane told the deputies to sweep roofs, voice even as a church psalm. Lydia ended her song with a hush that felt like a verdict. Silas rang the bell once, and the single note hung like a question. The boy blinked, alive, and Caleb felt a weight settle that was not the boy at all. Tommy said, "Stay, help me find him," and hope made it sound simple. The wind shifted, and the tower stared back like an unblinking eye. Sheriff Victor Crow gathered merchants with a smile that never reached his eyes. He spoke of safety funds and patrol wages, and the narrator felt the word tax wearing a mask. Coins clinked into a hat as Kane stood aside, serene as marble. Caleb watched from the edge, reading the pattern in the panic. Tommy whispered that the shooter must be part of a larger crew. Lydia drifted through the crowd like perfume, leaving unease behind. Silas traced a cross in the dust with his boot, then scuffed it out. Crow said, "We show strength now," and the phrase landed like a bill of sale. Kane tipped his hat, promising swift justice, and the square breathed again. The narrator marked the way relief can be purchased with fear. Caleb turned toward the church, because answers hide where echoes live. Lydia intercepted Caleb beneath the balcony shade, voice low enough to avoid the walls. She said, "Parades are nets," and the narrator weighed the tremor behind the poise. Caleb asked what she knew, and she looked toward Kane with a practiced softness. She said, "He saves what he endangers," and the words tasted like old smoke. Tommy hovered, hearing just enough to want more. Crow's deputies marched past with rifles that gleamed like rented promises. Silas paused at the chapel door, as if he might lock it against the day. Caleb thanked Lydia without trusting the shape of gratitude. She touched his sleeve, then let go as if burned by future blame. The wind carried the bell tower's shadow over them like a passing cloud. The narrator felt the hinge of the day begin to turn. Silas found Caleb near the chapel steps and studied the dust on his boots. He said, "You carry roads like sins," and the narrator heard the ache of miles between. Caleb asked if the tower would speak if climbed. Silas said, "All towers speak," then looked to the bell that had swallowed one shot. Tommy brought a coil of rope and a grin fighting fear. Lydia watched from the threshold, hands folded as if in prayer, not meant for gods. Crow paced the far side of the square, counting something that was not people. Kane stood with deputies and pointed to rooftops like a patient teacher. Silas told Caleb that mercy is a gun you holster on time. Caleb nodded and felt the old iron settle in his palm. The bell tolled once, and the day chose a path it could not unwalk. The desert night had barely lifted when Caleb sat on the chapel step, staring at his torn sleeve. He muttered that he would not let another town burn because of hollow stars. Tommy dropped beside him, eyes restless but glowing with faith. The narrator traced how the boy's hope clung like ivy on stone, asking Caleb to stay one night, just one. Caleb said, "One night won't change your world," but the echo in his chest betrayed him. The air smelled of scorched grain and old fear. Cain's men rode patrols, their spurs speaking louder than prayers. Lydia's song floated from the balcony, soft enough to suggest chains. Silas watched from the bell, silent but knowing. Caleb breathed dust and decided against the long road, though his heart begged for it. Tommy smiled at the small victory as dawn stretched its fingers across the square. The narrator felt choice weigh heavier than bullets. Lydia found Caleb in the shadow of the saloon, her voice trembling though her eyes shone sharp. She whispered that Cain had saved her once, but the cost was a debt written in chains. Caleb studied her face and asked, "Why, tell me now?" She said, "Because you look like you'll fight when no one else will." The narrator marked how truth wore lace when spoken by fear. Tommy lingered by the door, ears catching fragments of guilt and warning. Cain's laughter carried from across the street, heavy as boots on glass. Lydia clutched Caleb's arm, then withdrew, ashamed of the plea. She looked skyward as if freedom lived in clouds she could never touch. Caleb promised nothing, yet his silence felt like a verdict. The air thickened with secrets left unburied, and the narrator felt the ground tilt toward revelation. Sheriff Crow gathered merchants at the courthouse steps, his smile sharpened by greed. He called it a security levy, but coins rang like chains. Cain stood above them, polished and patient, praised like a savior by frightened lips. Caleb leaned on the hitching post, arms folded, watching the show. Tommy whispered that this was not protection. It was theft wrapped in law. The narrator felt how fear sweetened obedience when sold by authority. A merchant begged for mercy, and Crow clapped him on the back like an old friend. Lydia watched from the balcony, her hand tight on the rail. Silas shook his head, muttering that faith cannot be bought. Cain tipped his hat, calm as a saint, while the square applauded. Caleb's silence sharpened into resolve, and the narrator heard a storm gather. Silas sat with Caleb in the chapel's quiet shade, dust drifting in golden beams. He said redemption is no gift, it's a road carved by pain. Caleb said he had walked too far in shadow. Silas pressed his scarred hand on Caleb's shoulder and told him choice still lived in his grip. Tommy entered, eager with a half smile, asking if they had a plan. Caleb looked away, unwilling to answer the boy's faith. The narrator felt the silence draw heavy as church bells. Lydia's voice drifted faint from the street, sorrow wrapped in song. Crow's men marched past, rifles clattering, reminding them all of the price of defiance. Silas whispered, "You can end what you once ran from," and Caleb lowered his eyes. The narrator marked the seed of reckoning buried deep. Caleb unfolded a torn ledger page under dim lamplight, the ink dark as dried blood. Tommy leaned close, eyes wide at the names and numbers. Lydia whispered that those were merchants' payments, bribes to Cana's riders. Caleb's jaw tightened, and he muttered that heroes don't leave ledgers. Silas nodded grimly, saying the page was proof of rot. Outside, the sheriff's men drank loudly, their laughter rough as gravel. The narrator felt truth cut deeper than any bullet, yet truth was a noose when spoken aloud. Caleb folded the page and tucked it inside his coat, a decision etched in dust and ink. Tommy asked, "What now?" And Caleb answered only with silence. Lydia's eyes glistened, torn between fear and relief, as if she had gambled her last secret. The night pressed in, heavy as judgment. The tower stairs groaned as Caleb led Tommy into the dim throat of the church. The narrator felt dust rise like old prayers denied by time. Tommy said he tasted metal in the air, and Caleb nodded without comfort. They reached the belfry and found a brass shell cooling in shadow. Caleb said, "Army issue?" And the words fell like a charge set to blow. The rifle lay staged with prints too neat to be true. Tommy asked why a killer would tidy a sin he could bury. Caleb answered that tidy scenes point at convenient ghosts. The bell hung mute above them, a dark moon over a false night. Caleb scanned the rooftops and traced a path a decoy would choose. He told Tommy to mark the angles and count the lies. The narrator measured how truth can be hidden in things that look perfect. Lydia waited in the narrow alley where barrels bled molasses on stone. She pressed a folded card into Caleb's palm and did not meet his eyes. She said the seal belonged to Cain, and the hour was midnight. Tommy glanced toward the street, as if law could read a heartbeat. Caleb unfolded the card and saw a warehouse mark burned in wax. Lydia said, "He gathers favors before auditors arrive." The narrator heard panic stitched into velvet. Caleb asked what she wanted in return, and Lydia smiled like someone bargaining with fate. She said she wanted breathing without permission. Tommy shifted, torn between duty and trust he could not weigh. Caleb tucked the seal into his coat and told them both to keep to shadows. The alley shrank around them, and the day felt shorter than the truth it held. Sheriff Crow marched deputies across the square like a sermon with rifles. The narrator watched doors slam as dissent turned into arrests on cue. Cain stood on the courthouse steps and thanked the crowd for patience. He promised order while cells swallowed tailors and teamsters. Caleb kept to the hitching rail and counted who vanished. Tommy said this was not justice, it was storage for fear. Cain lifted a hand, and the jeers softened into brittle applause. Crow called for curfew and smiled at the clink of keys. Lydia stared from the balcony, her knuckles pale on iron. Silas muttered that wolves dress fine when sheep are listening. Caleb said the warehouse would answer more than speeches. The square exhaled smoke and doubt, and felt smaller than it had at dawn. Silas led Caleb beyond the cemetery fence, where mesquite gnawed at stone. The narrator followed to a mound with no name and a tilted cross. Silas said a witness lay here who once spoke against Cain. He said the man drowned on dry land when no one was looking. Caleb knelt and brushed grit from the wood and found a bullet scar. Tommy traced the edges and blinked hard at what silence can buy. Silas confessed he had known Cain before the polish. He said the man loved order more than mercy and fear more than law. Caleb asked why this grave lacked letters, and Silas answered that truth rarely keeps monuments. The wind skimmed the grass and carried a bell note that was not a bell. Caleb rose and swore the nameless would be named. The earth listened without promise. Night bled into the freight yard where lanterns swung like tired suns. Caleb shadowed Crow along the tracks, keeping to creosote ghosts. The narrator saw 3 riders waiting with faces hidden by scarves. Spurs flashed under their coats, the kind issued to marshals with pride. Crow handed a sack that clinked like gilt measured in ounces. One rider counted slow, then nodded toward the town lights. Caleb marked the rhythm of tribute dressed as peace. Tommy crouched behind a crate and learned how power changes hands. A train coughed steam that swallowed words and gave them back thinner. Crow adjusted his coat as if he wore a virtue. Caleb whispered that the warehouse would open its mouth at midnight. The yard settled, heavy with deals that never see dawn. Midnight draped the warehouse in shadows that smelled of hemp and spilled grain. Caleb pressed against the wall with Tommy close behind. The narrator watched the boy's hands shake as a lantern flickered inside. Cain's voice rolled out smooth as oil, naming amounts and setting deadlines. Caleb peeked and saw crates marked for townsfolk, each stamped with lies. Cain said the auditors would find nothing if fear paid its rent. Crow stood stiff, nodding like a clerk bound to duty. Caleb whispered that this was no raid. This was collection. Tommy whispered back that heroes do not bill their towns. Lydia's words echoed from earlier, telling him Cain saves what he ruins. The narrator felt the truth close a trap on every name in that ledger. Caleb pressed his fist to the wall, steadying his rage for the right hour. A floorboard creaked under Tommy's boot, and Cain's head lifted with a smile. He said, "Let him go, we'll need bait." The narrator felt the trap snap quiet and clean. 2 deputies seized Tommy before Caleb could strike. Cain walked closer, revolver hanging easy, eyes shining with patience. He told the boy to run home and carry a warning in his shadow. Tommy bolted, face pale, guilt heavier than his steps. Caleb stayed frozen, his rage clamped under silence. Cain glanced at the wall, as though he knew who else watched. Crow smirked and whispered that mice always return for crumbs. The narrator knew Cain wanted Caleb alive, wanted him exposed in daylight. Caleb's jaw clenched as the boy's footsteps faded into the dark. Outside, under the awning, Lydia pulled Caleb into the glow of a dying lantern. She whispered that Cain used her once, luring men to their deaths so he could stage rescues. Caleb said, "And you played along." She flinched but nodded, voice cracking that she had no choice. The narrator felt confession weigh heavier than sin itself. "Oh." She begged him to leave before Cain made him into the next monster. Caleb said, running, "Won't change who he is." Lydia clutched his coat and whispered she wanted freedom more than love. The lantern hissed as if it heard her shame. Footsteps of deputies faded toward the square, and silence grew sharper. Caleb turned, refusing to promise anything, but his eyes showed resolve. The narrator measured the breaking of trust and the cost of choosing sides. Silas stood by the chapel door, moonlight framing his scarred face. Caleb approached, and the old man sighed as if the night had come full circle. He confessed he had once trained Cain years ago, teaching him to draw and to judge. He said Cain loved fear more than law, and he turned his lessons into poison. Caleb stared into the dust, voice low that mentors plant seeds they cannot always tend. Silas admitted walking away when he should have stayed. The narrator heard regret crack like old leather. Tommy leaned against the wall, pale from his narrow escape, clutching rope as if it offered strength. Silas told Caleb that stopping Cain might be the only atonement left for both of them. Caleb nodded slowly, his silence carrying more weight than words. Firelight rose over the granary as false bandits stormed in. Caleb and Tommy reached the edge too late, watching flames claw into the night sky. The narrator described Cain's entrance, late but lauded, riding like salvation painted in gold. Crow shouted that Caleb was seen near the blaze, his voice sharp as a noose. Townsfolk gathered, whispering of betrayal as smoke swallowed stars. Lydia stood frozen, torn between truth and the role she had played. Silas muttered that lies travel faster than hoofbeats. Caleb clenched his fists, knowing the game was written before he joined. Tommy whispered, "They'll blame you," and fear made it sound true. Cain raised his arms to the crowd, promising justice for the guilty. The narrator felt the tide turn, painting the devil as savior once more. Caleb cornered Cain in the freight yard where steam hissed like a serpent. Cain smiled as though the world was already his. He said, "I built the fear you all choke on, and then I sold the cure." Caleb spat dust and called him a devil wrapped in tin. Cain's eyes glinted with calm pride as he explained that a town always needs an enemy. He said, "I give them shadows, then I ride in as light." The narrator felt the weight of every cheer turning into a noose. Tommy watched from behind crates, trembling at the reveal. Silas muttered that monsters never hide, they just wear better clothes. Caleb clenched his fists, knowing the truth demanded blood or proof. Cain tapped his star, daring him to strike. The night seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a trigger. By dawn, Crow held a fresh poster, wet with ink. Caleb's face stared back, branded fugitive. Crow nailed it to the post with theatrical strikes, declaring the drifter guilty of the fire. The crowd murmured in confusion, but Cain lifted his hand and calmed them like a preacher. The narrator marked how truth is buried when ink runs faster than justice. Lydia gasped from the saloon porch, clutching her shawl. Tommy tried to speak out, but Crow's deputies shoved him back. Caleb, watching from an alley, whispered that his silence could not hold forever. Silas said the poster was a mask meant to blind the weak. The square filled with whispers, and fear grew into belief. Cain smiled, his shadow stretching longer than the morning sun. The trap was closing, and Caleb felt the weight of chains not yet locked. Lydia slipped into the stable's shadow and pressed a black ledger into Silas' hand. She whispered, "This is proof," her voice shaking like glass in wind. Caleb stepped closer, his eyes narrowing at the weight of the book. Silas opened the cover, scanning names and amounts that painted the town's ruin. Lydia said she had stolen it from Cain's locked desk, risking more than life. The narrator felt betrayal and redemption cross blades in her heart. Caleb asked why she gave it to him, and she said, "Because I want him gone." Tommy stared wide-eyed, whispering that the book could save them all. Silas warned that proof cuts deep but must be bared in front of the crowd. Caleb tucked the ledger into his coat, shoulders heavy with decision. Outside, spurs clattered closer, chasing silence. Cain's men struck swift, dragging Tommy from the alley and shoving him into the square. Cain raised his voice, offering a trade. Ledger for the boy. Caleb stepped from shadow, the narrator tracing the moment where fear and resolve met. Lydia cried out, trying to run forward, but Crow blocked her with a sneer. Silas held Caleb's arm, whispering that giving proof away meant damnation for all. Caleb's jaw tightened as he studied Tommy's frightened eyes. The crowd murmured, uneasy, not knowing whom to trust. Cain smirked, and called Caleb weak for hiding behind books. Caleb lifted his chin and said nothing, his silence carrying more than words. The narrator felt the balance tip, waiting for one step to decide the town's fate. The boy struggled as deputies tightened the ropes around his wrists. Caleb stood in the center of the square, ledger pressed inside his coat. He called out that tomorrow at noon, he would face Cain before all eyes. The narrator marked the ripple through the crowd, fear and hope tangled like barbed wire. Lydia's hand shook as she clutched the rail, her face pale but set. Silas closed his eyes, whispering that the bell would toll for judgment. Crow barked that Caleb would not live that long, but Cain lifted a hand, amused. He said, "Let him come. The sun will be our witness." The crowd gasped at his arrogance, mistaking it for courage. Tommy was dragged away, his eyes pleading for faith. Caleb turned, walking slow, the dust swallowing each step. The narrator felt the air itself harden, promising blood under the noon sky. The bell tolled as townsfolk gathered, drawn by fear and the promise of spectacle. Caleb stepped onto the platform, ledger in his hand, voice steady as he read names aloud. The narrator felt the crowd stiffen as familiar merchants' secrets spilled into daylight. Lydia leaned against the balcony rail, her face pale, her eyes wet with resolve. Silas stood near the steps, his frame frail yet unbending, urging Caleb with quiet nods. Tommy wriggled free from his captors, rushing to Caleb's side, his courage raw. "Now, Woody," Crow snarled, his jaw tight, barking for deputies to silence the words. Caleb's voice grew stronger, cutting through the murmur like a blade. Cain stepped forward at last, smiling as if called by destiny. The narrator felt the town itself hold its breath, a jury made of dust and silence. Cain stepped down from the courthouse stairs, every stride polished, every gesture calm. He raised his hand, and the murmurs bent into silence. The narrator heard him accuse Caleb of forging lies, saying the ledger was a counterfeit. Crow barked in agreement, calling Caleb a drifter bent on ruin. Deputies moved to rooftops, rifles glinting under the punishing sun. Caleb stood his ground, holding the ledger high, eyes blazing with defiance. Lydia leaned forward and shouted, her voice carrying truth the crowd feared. Silas whispered that lies always buckle when weighed against courage. Cain smirked, tipping his hat, daring Caleb to step closer. The narrator felt the weight of noon press down like a hammer, ready to strike sparks of war. Lydia's voice broke across the square as she confessed her part in Cain's staged rescues. Her words shook the crowd and a merchant stepped forward, trembling, to confirm the truth. Caleb lowered the ledger and let silence sharpen the testimony. Cain's smile faltered for the first time, though his eyes burned with menace. Crow shouted for her to stop, his face red, his hand hovering over steel. Tommy grabbed Caleb's sleeve, whispering that the tide was shifting. Silas raised his hands and called for the truth to be heard. The narrator mocked the moment when lies cracked like brittle glass. Cain's composure slipped, his smirk tightening into a snarl. The square vibrated with unease, teetering between faith in a star and the courage of confession. Dust rose as silence snapped into violence. Deputy's fingers twitched on triggers as Kane squared his shoulders. Caleb dropped the ledger into Silas' hands and stepped forward. Tommy darted toward him, tossing a spare cylinder with shaking hands. The narrator felt time stretch thin as the metal spun through air. Kane's revolver gleamed as he drew in a fluid motion, teeth bared. Caleb caught the cylinder, snapped it into place, and raised his weapon. The square erupted, gunfire slicing heat and dust, screams tearing through the crowd. Lydia screamed Caleb's name, her voice lost in the thunder. Silas clutched the ledger to his chest, shielding it like scripture. The narrator marked the clash as judgment painted itself in fire and grit. Crow staggered as Caleb's bullet struck, his body twisting before collapsing in the dust. The narrator watched fear ripple through the deputies as their leader fell. Kane reeled back, a crimson line across his shoulder, yet his grin returned, feral and gleaming. The townsfolk gasped, torn between horror and relief. Caleb advanced through the smoke, revolver steady, boots crunching glass and grit. Kane snarled, retreating toward the train yard, his figure swallowed by steam. Lydia gripped the rail with white knuckles, whispering prayers she did not know. Silas bent, coughing, blood staining his lips, but his eyes still clear. Tommy shouted for Caleb to finish it, voice raw with desperation. The narrator felt the duel unfinished, the storm only half spent. Steam rolled from the boxcars as Caleb followed the crimson smear between rails. The narrator mocked how the iron sang like a choir of knives. Kane limped ahead, laughing softly as if the dark were his partner. Silas stepped from shadow and raised a palm that begged for peace. Kane fired, and the world rang like a struck anvil. Silas staggered, whispering that mercy still has a chance. Caleb caught him, saying, "Hold on," though the words felt thin as paper. Tommy skidded in, eyes wide, calling for help that would not come. Lydia reached them, breath-breaking, and pressed a ribbon into Silas' hand. The bell from town tolled once, and the night bent around the sound. Silas gripped Caleb's wrist, and spoke softly that a name means little without a choice. The narrator heard the rails sing while ash settled like gray snow. Caleb said, "I will end this." And Silas smiled with a peace that hurt to see. He pressed the ribbon into Caleb's palm and let his hand fall. Tommy whispered a prayer that stumbled over grief. Lydia closed Silas's eyes and said, "Rest now," as if the word could hold him. A horn wailed, dragging the moment forward. Caleb rose, heavier than iron, and fixed his gaze on the dark throat of the yard. Kane's footprints glittered with blood under the lantern light. The night waited, quiet as a loaded gun. Caleb found Kane between two cars where steam curtained the rails. Kane said, "Wear the star, and they will forgive everything." The narrator felt the offer land like poison wrapped in silk. Caleb answered that forgiveness without truth is just another noose. Kane's grin cracked into a snarl, and his hand settled on steel. Tommy's shout echoed, urging Caleb to finish what began at noon. Lydia watched from the ladder, face pale, fingers white on iron. Caleb lowered the ribbon into his pocket like a quiet oath. The steam parted, and their eyes locked across a breath of heat. The yard hushed, measuring a distance that could be crossed in one pull. Kane drew first, fast as a striking hole. Caleb shifted, steel flashing like a thought made solid. The narrator counted 2 shots that sounded like one. Sparks leapt from iron, and steam tore apart in a bright wound. Kane stumbled, clutching the failing light in his eyes. Caleb stepped in, breathing like a man at the edge of a cliff. Kane said, "They will love me tomorrow," but the words came thin and broken. Caleb answered that tomorrow belongs to truth, not ceremony. Kane reached again and found only air. The yard exhaled, and the night let go. Dawn rinsed the square clean, though ash still clung to the eaves. Caleb set the marshal's star on a post and stepped back. The narrator watched Tommy tie the ribbon there, a small flag for truth. Lydia placed the ledger on the judge's desk, hands steady at last. Bells rang not for grief but for naming. Caleb met Lydia's gaze and said, "Keep the town honest." She nodded, saying, "Keep yourself alive." Tommy promised to learn the law before he ever reached for steel. Caleb turned his horse toward the open road and did not look back. The empty reviewing stand faced the sun and learned what heroes are not.